Welcome everyone to the Charles Sturt EdX conference for 2023. The Charles Sturt Teaching Academy is proud to present and sponsor and support and promote the Charles Sturt EdX event. It is my honour to start the day by giving a few points of administrivia, and then I'll be doing an acknowledgement and welcoming the DVCA. I'd like you to note that we are recording this session, so you'll be getting your usual note about that on your screen. So this is important that we share this for far and wide, and not just with the folks joining us today. As you all have, please keep your microphones turned off unless you are actually speaking or required to speak. Questions can be put into the chat, but also there will be time for Q&A in most of the sessions. I'd like to now start, actually, before I introduce Graham, I'd like to start with the acknowledgement of country. So if we could have that slide, please. Thank you. I'm honoured to share this slide with you for the first time. This is the Division of Learning and Teaching Acknowledgement of Country, developed by our Goulet team, and I thank them very much. The Division of Learning and Teaching acknowledges the transformative effect of education. Our impact leads to ever-improving educational outcomes, inspiring our students to create a world worth living in. We recognise the inclusive nature of First Nations educational practices and the innovative strategies that have ensured the continuing diversity of lands, waters and peoples for millennia. We also acknowledge that in our practice we are guided by the elders past and present of the country in which our campuses live: Wiradjuri, Biripi, Gundungurra and Ngunnawal. In the spirit of Yinmara Wundagana, we recognise the depth of the First Nations ways of being, ways of knowing and ways of doing, inspiring our commitment in supporting staff and students in the wisdom of respectfully knowing how to live well in a world worth living in. Thank you. It is now my honour to introduce Professor Graham Brown, our Deputy Vice-Chancellor Academic. As the Vice-Chancellor's Senior Academic Executive, Professor Brown oversees the delivery of academic programs, the maintenance of academic standards, the provision of learning and teaching support, and the operation of the faculties. Prior to joining Charles Sturt, Professor Brown held several leadership roles at the University of Western Australia, including PVC academic, and held a number of academic and research roles in his native UK. I now hand over to the Honourable Graham Brown.
Thanks, Lisa, for that introduction, and thank you all for coming along. I'd like to add my respects to the Whadjuk Noongar people of Western Australia, on whose lands I am located this morning on, as you can probably see behind me, a glorious sunny day. Also, for those thinking, who's that dashing young man that's replaced our grizzled old DVCA, I had a fight with a beard trimmer a couple of days ago and lost, and I'm desperately growing it back as fast as I can. It's a real pleasure to welcome you all to this Charles Sturt EdX conference. I think I've had a look through the program, and I'm going to be dipping in and out as I can over the next couple of days, but it's a really exciting set of papers, I think, and two really key themes, I think, that are coming out in those papers, which I'll talk a little bit about in a minute, which is dealing positively with AI, so incorporating AI in a positive way into our teaching and learning, and really reimagining assessment. And to me, those two things are very linked, and for us, a kind of an agenda for us for this year will be to think about that as we go forward, I think. But this conference comes at the close of the first year of the Teaching Academy operations, and so I want to start off by celebrating some of the successes we've had with the Teaching Academy so far. Now, whenever I do things like this, I get a briefing note that tells me what I have to say. But one of the things that they didn't put on there, because they're too humble and modest, which I'm going to start with, is the appointment and arrival of our fantastic director, Kushila Kumar. So firstly, you know, I think that's a fantastic appointment that we've made, and those of us who have worked with Kushila already can see the changes and the supportive way in which she's going to drive and support for teaching excellence across the university. Welcome again, Kushila, and we look forward to working with you over the next year or so. In terms of what the Teaching Academy has achieved already this year, I think it really is quite significant. We had obviously the Teaching Academy grants, and in the inaugural scheme, we had 17 grants awarded, sharing more than $77,000 for projects to improve learning and teaching. And key priority areas which we've addressed there are authenticity in learning experiences and assessment. Again, that key issue for us, I think, around authentic assessment, elevating teaching presence in hybrid learning, supporting student success to foster retention, exploring sustainable course design, and technologies that add value to staff and students, and advancing First Nations education. So all of those things really align with our education strategy and what we want to achieve in the learning and teaching space as a university. We've also had a lot of success this year in teaching awards, both internally and externally. Last year, at the end of last year, we got the AAUT Program Award, which was a fantastic achievement. The sort of capstone teaching award from the AAUT for the CSU retention team for programs that improve student progress and retention. And that program was also a finalist, although sadly not successful, in the AFR Higher Education Awards as well. This year, we also have another citation submission going in for this year's awards. Anna Horter from Faculty of Science is a nominee for the citation for outstanding contribution to student learning and teaching. We also absolutely ruled the roost at the Regional Universities Network teaching conference, and we took out first place in the Learning and Teaching Awards there, and we'll be celebrating those on day 3. And then, of course, our internal awards, which are equally valuable and a good way to work towards preparing for one of these national awards. The Executive Dean's Teaching Awards, which again will be announced and celebrated at the awards session on day 3. And the Change One Thing Awards, which is a set of small grants of about $1,000 to support learning and teaching oriented professional development. And again, that's very much aligned, particularly to the RUN Learning and Teaching Awards. Other activities that the Academy have been supporting and promoting, higher education fellowship. We've got 12 applicants at the moment, 5 senior fellows, 7 fellows to go through the higher education fellowship scheme, which is great for personal development and for that kind of reflective experience that the HEA fellowship brings, which then events like this are great for sharing across a wider community. We have a virtual roadshow at the moment happening with Kushila, our new director, visiting virtually all the schools and centres to give a bit more detail and engage on the Teaching Academy and its direction. And then we also have the appointment of the Teaching Academy leads representing the voice of the schools. So those of you who were engaged in the development of the Teaching Academy will remember that we were very clear that we wanted to make sure that this was an engaged and embedded academy, that it wasn't sort of a little set of people who sat on one side and dictated what good learning and teaching looks like. And so that model of hub and spoke with the school level leads, really making sure that there's a good productive relationship between the schools and the centres and the Teaching Academy. So thank you very much to those people who have put their hands up for that role. I think that's going to be absolutely critical to the success. So then that brings us to the agenda for the next 3 days, which, as I've said already, you know, it looks like a really exciting set of presentations. We have a fantastic, what will undoubtedly be a fantastic keynote address from Associate Professor Guy Curtis, one of my former colleagues from UWI, actually, who's just absolutely at the forefront of really researching and thinking through academic integrity issues. He was invaluable for me when I was Pro Vice Chancellor Academic at UWA, for a really empathetic but realistic approach to why people cheat. As a psychologist, a lot of his research has been about why people cheat and understanding that there's two or multiple different ways in which multiple different drivers of cheating, and that perhaps some of them we can look at more sympathetically than others. But certainly the main thrust of his research, I think, is to suggest that you need different ways to address academic integrity when you understand the different drivers of breaches and cheating. I won't give away any more because he's a fantastic speaker and I'm sure he'll be really, really great. We've got 26 presentations, as I say, focus on assessment, innovative learning, and scaffolded critical thinking, and also quite a lot, unsurprisingly, but nonetheless, really pleasingly about how we can use AI, generative AI in particular, constructively within our education. We have the award sessions that I've already talked about, a masterclass with the experiences of the early adopters of the new LMS, which I think is going to be critical for communications around as we move into that sort of exciting new era of the LMS. And I'll be back in for a student panel, which is a conversation between me and some of the students on some of the key topics and challenges that they're facing. So look, that's a lot to be covering in 3 days, and as I said, I'm going to drop in and out as I can over the next few days, as I'm sure many people will be. But I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes reflecting on the profile of the papers we've got and where it sees us maybe heading as a university, and perhaps to encourage us to be even more radical in our thinking about this. So as many, well, hopefully everyone knows, but maybe not everyone, when ChatGPT first sort of crashed onto the scene just about a year ago, really. Lots of universities took a very different approach to what they did around it, and a small number of universities, including Charles Sturt, took the view that we should make ChatGPT forbidden and less allowed. Some other universities, including I think all of the South Australian universities, went to the exact diametric opposite and said open slather on AI as long as you declare that you have used it in the preparation of your assignments, then it was considered acceptable. Obviously, where you've got constrained environments like examinations, it wouldn't have been acceptable, but as a general principle. Now, for me, one of the reasons why we took the decision, the conservative decision around that, was because everybody could see immediately that this presented a huge threat to academic integrity as traditionally understood. And my view, and I think the view that we took institutionally, was that we really needed to understand this software and understand its development and its application before we allowed its use. So that was the reason why we decided to say not allowed until allowed. But over the course of the year, there's been a lot of research and work and exploration of the potential of AI, both within Charles Sturt, but of course across the sector, and increasingly it's becoming very clear that it's an absolute game changer for universities. There's just no pretending it's not, and I think that the allowed all the time approach is ironically a little bit more stick your head in the sand than the approach that we took, because the allowed all the time is not kind of acknowledging the changes that this is making for universities. But the thing that's become very clear to me over the course of the year as well is that it's not just changing universities, it's also changing the professions that we're teaching into, and we'll change them radically. And so we have to increasingly teach how to use AI, not how not to use AI, because people across all kinds of professions that we are training for, that we are educating for, will be using AI in their day-to-day work, whether it's diagnostic AI in medicine, which even before ChatGPT was outperforming humans in some areas, such as breast cancer detection, whether it's legal analysis. So there are now some law companies that are using openly using AI for their first cut legal analysis. So they get provided the scenario basically by their clients, and then they ask ChatGPT, or not ChatGPT, but a version of an instance of a generative AI program to do a first cut analysis of it, and then the lawyer comes through and revises it and checks it. And that's the kind of thing that will just become day-to-day use in many, many professions. So we should also be looking at how we build that into our assessment structures and our other practices. We're looking at the moment, exploring how we could use generative AI in a very similar way to assist with student marking. So that link to assessments, and saying, well, is there ways in which we can have AI assisted marking to radically reduce the cost and the administrative burden of marking, and to ensure that students get their feedback in a much more timely way, particularly in large cohorts where it's often a struggle to get all of the assessments marked within a fast turnaround time. So I think we need to be thinking a lot more positively now about AI and how we can build it into our teaching, how we can build it into our assessment design, but also being very clear where we need it not to be used. And a lot of universities, ANU including, are really shifting back to in-person examinations of one form or another, where the requirement of, for want of a better term, invigilated, proctored conditions are necessary. And I think that's the kind of thing we have to be very realistic about and say, unless the student is in front of us, the ability to invigilate and proctor where that is the learning outcome that we are assessing is, or the learning outcomes are those kinds of learning outcomes that are best or only assessed within a invigilated environment. We have to be very clear about the impossibility, I think, of maintaining a really strong academic integrity environment unless the student is physically in front of us. So there's positives and there's also challenges for us in thinking about how we do assessments, but there's a lot of really interesting propositions, I think, coming out of the work we're looking at today, the papers we're looking at today, about how we go towards that. Which brings me to perhaps the sort of one of the a little bit more radical challenges that I want to throw out and suggest we have a conversation about, which is the nature of assessment altogether, and really maybe having a very thorough, deep searching, no holds barred, nothing off the table conversation about why we assess and how we assess in an environment in which HI is really, challenging assessment design. And one of the brain farts that I think that's a scientific term that I've been sort of discussing with a few people and just throwing out now to bounce around is, how much of our assessment could we make voluntary? So could you imagine a system in which you had a competency-based required assessment structure, which ensured that students were progressing, getting the knowledge that they needed, particularly maybe in professional pathways, where ultimately for many students the outcome sought is licensed practice, not perhaps a high distinction or a 2-1 or a pathway into honours, but licensed practice, and then create a system in which those additional marks that might get you onto an honours programme, might get you a distinction or high distinction, was an entirely voluntary form of assessment. To me, it's I'm sure there's significant problems with it, but it's a really interesting idea to explore, because if you make assessment voluntary for those who want the perhaps the additional advantage of a higher credit degree or a pathway through to honours and HDR ultimately. But you're almost sort of, there's almost a whittling out of a lot of potential academic breaches if for those people for whom university is a means to an end. And I think often universities look at students who see university education as a means to an end. We have a tendency to look at them a little bit derogatorily and dismissively. And to me, it's absolutely legitimate and indeed the reality is the reason why most students go to university is as a means to an end, i.e. to get a qualification that will get them the kind of job that they want. That it may well be that we can design assessment structures for those students, which is much more reflective of their needs and much more cost effective and has a higher degree of academic integrity in it. So one of our papers later on today is looking at hyper flexible assessment deadlines and in essence giving students the ability to submit their assessments whenever they want throughout the course of the subject. That's to me is really exciting as a kind of step in this kind of direction and putting the assessment regime a little bit more in the students' hands and saying to them, what do they want out of university? How can we assess them best for that? And creating that flexibility and reducing the incentive, looping back around to the kinds of things that Guy Curtis talks about, the incentive to cheat when if what you're actually looking for is competency-based assessment in order to be able to practice in a particular field, then maybe we should be thinking about how we can provide students with assessments that match onto that rather than those kind of higher level testing. And we know that a lot of our students coming through TAFE pathways, which is our largest cohort of undergraduate students, find it very challenging, the transition from TAFE assessment, which is typically competency-based pass-fail, to a more university-style assessment measurement. So that's my sort of little poking the bear for the next 3 days. It may well be an entirely unfeasible idea, but in the interest of engaging in a discussion around teaching and learning, I thought I'd throw that out there. There's a lot of other really interesting papers, I think, and lots of innovations beyond assessment and AI in our presentations over today and the following days. So I really hope you have a fantastic couple of days. And as I say, I'm going to pop in and watch where I can. And I'll pass back to Lisa for the rest of the proceedings.
Thank you very much, Graham, and thanks for a fantastic, provocative as always, and interesting opening. I'd like to thank everyone for attending and remind everyone that there are 2 concurrent sessions coming up, and I wish you all the best and have a great time. Thank you very much.